very much for having me. As everyone here is well aware, there is a lot to say about Gerard Manley Hopkins. His poetry, his spirituality, his philosophical outlook, and his personality merge into a web of complex and often contradictory impulses and theories. Discussing any one of them necessarily means to potentially disregard another aspect that is equally important. Today I would like to discuss just this dichotomy between impulse and theory as it transpires from Hopkins's diaries. I will show that the diaries were not just the nexus of private and public worlds, but that these writing venues allowed him to connect emotional control and creative expression. In their capacity to foster, materialize, and reflect an authorial persona, the diaries were a means of embodying and maintaining authorship and respectability. At last year's Hopkins Festival, Michael O'Dwyer presented a paper on Hopkins's notebooks and journals, which he has very kindly shared with me. Based on the theories of renowned French autobiography critics, such as Georges Gustave and Alain Girard, O'Dwyer showed the importance of diaries in the quest for identity and the search for coherence and a permanent existential basis. Hopkins's diurnal writing is composed by two types of diarism. Firstly, the inner-directed notebooks, dating back to 1865 to 1866. They predominantly contain confession notes and demonstrate the efforts the young Hopkins made to manage his homoerotic desires. Secondly, the journal, which commences in 1866 and ends in 1875, and which displays a much stronger focus on the outside world. My paper today builds on O'Dwyer's reflections on the diary as a forum for self-examination by proposing that the diary is also a tool for self-management and self-fashioning. While Howard J. Fulwiler has called Hopkins the Victorian poet of the self, this self should not be understood as fulfilled, actualized, or unified. Throughout his life, Hopkins struggled to reconcile his emotional self, the self that society deemed acceptable, and an ideal ascetic self. As Hopkins found himself between conflicting ideas, such as renunciation and pleasure, abstinence and consummation, and worship and creativity, he greatly exerted himself trying to settle the quarrel between social religious convention and personal fulfillment. The diary became the site in which these conflicting interests were reconciled, negotiated, and channeled, with mixed success. Without openly discussing these issues, Hopkins nevertheless made them the object of his diaristic writing. According to diary scholar Philippe Lejeune, diarists tend to choose distinct parameters for their occupation. Quote, "By definition, writing a diary is free, totally free. But in fact, each diarist quickly settles into a small number of forms of language that become molds for all of his entries and never deviates from them." For Hopkins, these conceptual molds were the acts of feeling, seeing, and worshipping. And as I will show, all three were intimately connected in making up his worldview during the decade in which he kept a diary, which is 1865 to 1875. I'll just take this off, sorry. I have now repeatedly alluded to Hopkins's need to negotiate his otherness, which motivated many of his religious and creative choices. Many scholars have argued that his sexual orientation to a great extent determined his professional and religious path, as well as the shape and subject of his writing. Hopkins's decision to join the Jesuit order, for instance, can be seen as a strategy to manage his otherness, because it forced him and helped him to abandon and replace inculpating worldly tongues. So a discussion of Hopkins's management of his emotional life must necessarily consider the poet's sexual orientation, which over the years has been the subject of debate. Denis Sobolev has shown that it wasn't until the mid-1970s that scholars began to comment on Hopkins' sexuality and on homosexuality in his texts. In the 1980s, the subject became marginal again. It returned in the 1990s with David Della Mora's study that linked Hopkins' homosexuality to Oxford aestheticism, and it has been consistently addressed since then. Hopkins' unequivocal attraction to men and his awareness of this attraction, to use Sobolev's words, has been uncontested since the publication of the notebooks. Julia F. Saville, who has written beautifully about Hopkins' homoerotic asceticism, describes the poet's career as a continuous process of negotiating desire through self-discipline, self-denial, and even at times self-hatred. It is clear that Hopkins experienced his homoerotic inclinations as a source of undesirable otherness, but Saville makes the important point that he did not counter it through repression, as Freudian and Lacanian criticism would have us expect. Indeed, as I would like to argue in this paper, Hopkins did not simply suppress or ignore his desires, but he sought to render them useful. Through displacing his gaze from the male body onto plants, landscapes, and sometimes buildings, he could manage his desires and turn them into what I call productive emotion, which is emotion that maintains the strength of passionate arousal, but displays the rigor of rational thought. In this sense, he sought to control impulse through theory, providing himself with the security he could not receive from human relationships or a stable career path, as he often felt like fortune's football. These ways of coping are not the sign of an individual giving up on himself, but they rather demonstrate a strong belief in his own agency and his power of self-signification, which would fade in the late 1870s. My exploration of productive emotion is based on the concept of emotional labor, which designates the purposeful channeling of emotional energy towards an outcome that is perceived to be fruitful and respectable. The term was first coined by the American sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild in her 1975 study, The Managed Heart, the Commercialization of Human Feeling. Hochschild discussed the artificially created elation and warmth that airline cabin crew are paid to display and spread. Quote, "This labor requires one to induce or suppress feeling in order to sustain the outward countenance that produces the proper state of mind in others. When my study examines the goal-oriented processing and molding of emotional excitability, it does not, however, address the aspect of manipulating others' emotions. Odette Clark, in her study about the management of the emotions in the diary of Caroline Wyndham Quinn, the Countess of Dunraven, who lived from 1790 to 1870, has employed Hochschild's work to argue that, quote, the very articulation of the emotion can be regarded as an individual's attempt to convert an immediate physiological reaction into a normative one. Emotional labor can thus be seen as the process that converts emotional energy into a workable product. Because Hopkins perceived emotion derived from homoerotic arousal as illegitimate and therefore unusable, he conceived of ways of making it valuable, if not acceptable. So he chose to completely identify with his occupation as an observer of nature and art, this is in the diary, of course, drawing his personal value from a trilateral system that connected him to God and to God's creations. His emotional labor consisted of emotionally responding to the objects he observed, rather than in merely registering them visually. The fact that Hopkins regarded his emotions as currents of the body that he was able to use for different purposes reflects wider trends in the field of psychology. Generally speaking, 19th century psychologists were eager to objectivize and catalogue any sort of feeling through scientific inquiry and factual knowledge. Through self-conscious command, the individual was encouraged to transform raw feeling into a secondary product, emotion. Manuals by Alexander Bain, W.B. Carpenter, or T.S. Clausen attributed moral importance to emotional control. In their endeavor to adopt a physiological approach to the mind and to perfect the will as an instrument of self-improvement, their works in a sense function as prescriptive texts comparable to Samuel Smiles's Self-Help of 1859, which established productivity as a fundamentally moral quality. While emotional management, as described in Victorian psychology, had moral and repressive goals, I would like to show its importance for inspiration, creativity, and imaginativeness. Peter Stearns observes in his study of the Victorian emotional style that, quote, emotional excess was obviously condemned, but so was emotional facility. The Victorians sought, as basic ingredients of good character, the capacity for deep feeling, along with the capacity to direct that feeling to appropriate targets. Feeling here designates excitability, which is turned into emotion through emotional management, as I have suggested. In this process, the diary had an important function for Victorians. Bain's study, The Emotions and the Will, of 1859, for instance, explicitly recommends the use of a diary to make educated decisions. Bain advised to record every evening, quote, the impression of the day, or to put down the side which preponderates according to the balance of motives passing through the mind in the course of that day. He approaches the solving of a crisis like a scientific problem to avoid partiality caused by unnecessary and unproductive emotional investment. The lapse of time between entries, Bain hopes, should reduce the casual or accidental biases to a general average. The purpose of weighing, quote, all the states of mind that we pass through against the opposing questions is to produce a logical synthesis. In his early notebook, Hopkins reports the pressure to appear and act disinterested, as his entry of March 12, 1865 shows. Quote, Alice says my arguments are coloured and lose their value by personal feeling. This ought to be repressed. His close friend at Oxford, William Addis, advised him to eradicate emotional inclinations that might spoil rational thought processes. In fact, the fact, however, that Hopkins does not say, I ought to repress this, indicates that the need for repression is a cultural demand rather than a self-chosen one. While diaries certainly mirror individual interiority, which is not always rational, they are in themselves fundamentally rational tools that help diarists shape and design public and private personas. As economist Habermas has argued, recalling the theories of Philippe Lejeune, diaries stem from the tradition of financial bookkeeping and from a striving to maximize personal resources. Quote, diaries not only served to make entries on various subjects, but they also were a teaching and training device by means of which the Victorian middle class learned to behave as responsible and reliable citizens, merchants, and consumers in a market society. And here I have a bit of an illustration of a list of expenditures and then a free-flowing text on the other side. It's just a random example of a Victorian diary. As I have shown elsewhere, the practice of listing money earned and pages read does not fundamentally differ from that of recording emotional pleasures and grievances. Diaries rather frequently resemble spreadsheets that trace productivity in terms of professional and personal progress. They thus reflect the widespread Victorian belief in the perfectibility of the individual through efficiency and organization. In the journal, Hopkins is less interested in listing and evaluating achievements and failures than George Eliot or George Gissing are in their diaries. For instance, he employed his diaries to craft a very specific persona for himself. His diaries, particularly the journal, revolve around the signifying God. It became the site from which his poetic gaze appropriated the world, which means that Hopkins not only reported his observations of visual beauty, but he also observed himself as an observer. The self-reflexive mechanisms of the diary allowed him to ground and develop the personal narrative through which he integrated himself in the natural world. His diaristic writing, as much as his poetry, was a means to strengthen his emotional connectedness to God and his creatures, and to assert his agency as a signifying observer. Throughout his life, Hopkins demonstrated an unquenchable need to write. Writing lent permanence and depth to his perceptions. It reinforced his dutiful engagement with God's creations, as it prolonged the communication between object and observer. Hopkins's diary accordingly manifests a strong compulsion to collect and possess visual impressions. As one entry of 1874 shows, Hopkins liked to capture himself in the process of observation, even in retrospect. Quote, "My eye was struck by such a sense of green in the tufts and patches of grass, with purple shadow thrown back on the dry mold behind them, as I do not remember ever to have been exceeded in looking at green grass. I marked this down on a slip of paper at the time, because the eye for colour, rather than the zest in the mind, seems to weaken with years, but now the paper is mislaid." Hopkins's reaction to represent the experienced luminosity on paper is immediate, almost instinctive. Since the slip of paper had been lost, Hopkins compensated for the consequent loss of memory by entering the experience into his diary, thus making it durable. The fact of having observed becomes just as remarkable as the observation itself. Another instance of Hopkins recreating a nature walk after a considerable lapse of time dates back to August 1874. It depicts his recollections of Little Halden near Dartmoor. Quote, "I have forgotten even now much, but this was a very beautiful sight. Even if the precise memory was by then lacking, he insisted on retaining the remaining impressions. The wish to acknowledge even what had been forgotten and was therefore absent is indicative of a strong desire for control, possession, and groundedness." As David Hilliard and Julia F. Saville have suggested, it was during his student years in Oxford that Hopkins began to seek control over his otherness through writing. This coping strategy became particularly important when in February 1865, Hopkins made the acquaintance of Digby Mackworth Dolben, a young religious poet who was going to convert to Catholicism but who drowned at age 19. Hopkins was extremely taken by Dolben's beauty and his religious devotion. This strong attraction resulted in sexual guilt, which Hopkins counteracted by writing confession notes. He thus tried to manage his homoerotic desire through the codes of Anglo-Catholicism, as did many men during the 19th century, according to Hilliard. The confession notes of 1865 to 1866 are predominantly concerned with Hopkins's behavior as an observer, as he self-consciously monitored the movements of his gaze and the triggers of arousal. Norman H. Mackenzie has proposed that in order to make confession as beneficial as possible, Hopkins probably responded to a set of questions from a manual, such as questions for self-examination for common use. This volume contained questions like, have I sought to be noticed, especially by the opposite sex? Have I taken undue notice of them, not made a covenant with mine eyes? In the religious framework that Hopkins chose for his life, gazing at humans was a possible transgression, so he worked actively to tame his eye. During his student years, the eye, more so than the rest of his body, seems to have directly corresponded to the more physical, homoerotic emotions. In a number of confession notes, Hopkins owned up to the challenges of keeping his eye from protruding into forbidden territories. So I quote several. Looking at a face in the theatre, looking at boys, several instances, and foolishness also. Vanity after looking into glass. imprudent looking at organ boy and other boys, looking at temptations, especially at gathered naked. The confession notes show that he looked to Catholicism to acquire techniques by which to strengthen his willpower and maintain control over the senses. If, as Francis L. Fenton has noted, confession is, quote, a form of reinterpretation of the consciousness, a kind of rebalancing through reflective acts of self-positing, the same is true for the diary. During the remainder of the 1860s up to 1875, Hopkins used his diary to rebalance his potentially transgressive attraction to male beauty through a conscious attachment mostly to plants. By constructing them as animated beings that actively invited his gaze, Hopkins was able to view himself as connected to nature through a relationship of magnetic symbiosis. Through investing all his emotional energy into observing natural objects, he worshipped God, who had created all this splendor. His very famous entry of May 18, 1870, is a clear indication of the religious dimension of the act of seeing. Quote, one day when the bluebells were in bloom, I wrote the following. I do not think I have ever seen anything more beautiful than the bluebell I have been looking at. I know the beauty of our Lord by it. The desire for unification did not just stem from a need for legitimation or belonging. The atomist trends in philosophy and science of the 1850s had terrified Hopkins, as Tom Zaniello has observed. Quote, he was groping for a theory of perception that would involve the mind's active participation in the perception of nature. His wish to give a new form to the senses gave rise to a highly personalized and theoretical ontological system, which, according to Zaniello, offered tentative solutions to the problems in epistemology he had been struggling with for years. In the 1870s, Hopkins's diary displays a very strong identification with nature. After his conversion, natural objects became his primary sensory stimulants, apart from representations of Christ. Hopkins ascribed consciousness to the natural objects he observed and described their growth and aspect as their behavior. As Mary Ellen Belanca has observed, Hopkins's diary does not merely, quote, reflect or record objects, but it performs an epistemic or knowledge-seeking function. It enables his insights, enacts his perceptions for later recording, and embodies his very processes of thinking and discovery. Belanca's observation is true for Hopkins's ontological system, built on the concepts of inscape and instress. I'm sure everyone is very familiar with these concepts, but I'll just go through them. Through constructing the world as an interconnected, fundamentally responsive system in his diary, Hopkins sought to render productive the transgressive aspects of his self and to conceive of a reality that was based on union. The tame die formed the basis of Hopkins's construct, as he believed that he could protrude into the natural object and gain access to its inscape. J. Hillis Miller has described this crucial turn as, quote, the inner law or pattern which any one oak tree, cloud, or flower shares with similar trees, clouds, or flowers. In Hopkins's narrative, any natural object belonged to a patterned system, but was ultimately unique in itself. As Walter J. Ong has explained, quote, the inscape of the being is the distinctive controlling energy that makes the being itself and connects it distinctively with all else. Margaret R. Ellsberg has defined inscape as, quote, universality and particularity unified in a precise identity. And Hilary Fraser has emphasized the direct link between Hopkins' aestheticism and his religion, which presented nature as a mirror of Christ. For Hopkins, animated natural objects constantly strove to reach as high a level of perfection as possible. So I quote from Hilary Fraser. Christ incarnate, the physical manifestation of God, represented for Hopkins in his selfhood the pattern, the inscape, to
which all created forms aspire. The distinctiveness of certain forms, of certain experiences of beauty, was explained by their resemblance to the uniqueness of Christ's religious, aesthetic, and poetic experience alike. Christ represented the ultimate inscape, and through his incarnation, the principles of perfect physical and moral beauty, love and sacrifice, became manifest in the created world. Christ was thus the physical representative of divine perfection, a view which was important to Hopkins because it relativized the dangerous aspects of male beauty. The term in stress designates the energy that communicated the inscape of an object or being to the perceiver. Ellsberg has characterized in stress as, quote, the undercurrent of energy, the inner pressure that holds things up and together and gives them observable intelligibility. In stress is thus almost synonymous for feeling or sensation, both within the object and, as Ong has argued, within the observer. Quote, in stress is the action that takes place when the inscape of a given being fuses itself in a given human consciousness in contact at a given moment with the being. The instress of an object or being enters the consciousness of the perceiving other, which then allows inscape to be realized. Thanks to these definitions, Hopkins could consolidate his belief in the interconnectedness of all of God's creations and integrate himself as a passive observer but an active signifier. Although Hopkins actively selected the objects to which he devoted his attention, in his diary he portrayed himself as an observer who waited for the natural objects to present themselves to his gaze. Heuser has proposed that for Hopkins, quote, the observer, the fixed register of sense impressions, became the focus both of reception, acceptance, and of quickening participation. Objects penetrated Hopkins's consciousness through the opening of the eye, but when the observer's mind was oblivious to this process, they remained without meaning. By thus stressing the observed object's dependence on his own acknowledgement, Hopkins established himself as the center around which nature revolved. When in autumn 1869, Hopkins looked at a fine sunset from the upstairs windows, he felt enraptured by nature's luminous plenitude. Quote, my eye was suddenly caught by the scaping of the leaves that grow in alleys and avenues. I noticed it first in an elm and then in limes. They fall from the two sides of the branch or spray in two marked planes which meet at a right angle or more. This comes from the endeavor to catch the light on either side, which falls left and right, but not all round. Significantly, Hopkins's eye, as in the gaze, became aware of the spectacular appearance of the leaves before his eye self did, which means that he imagined his visual consciousness to precede his analytical mind. Observation thus consisted of the mental process of interpreting visual stimuli rather than merely receiving them. We see that Hopkins theorized his visual impulses when presenting himself as having little control over the leaves that wooed his eye and ensnared him like lianas. Their endeavor to catch the light presupposes a desire to appeal to his attention. Hopkins not only ascribed a conscious desire to be looked at to natural objects, but he also imagined them to return his gaze. Quote, what you look hard at seems to look hard at you. This entry of 1871 epitomizes Hopkins's utopian hope of overcoming the isolation of the observer and establishing a mutually nourishing relationship with nature. Until 1875, the diaries display countless personification of natural elements, such as the attribution of agency to the wind operating the clouds. In March 1870, quote, in the park in the afternoon, the wind was driving little clouds of snow dust, which caught the sun as they rose and delightfully took the eyes. In this entry, Hopkins bestowed consciousness upon the clouds, which adopt a favorable light in order to conquer the observer's eye. In order to establish the communication between object and observer, Hopkins depicted himself at once as a passive openness and a focused lens. On August 24, 1870, for instance, Hopkins deplored that the limited time available to him impeded him from fully connecting to Edinburgh's magnificent architectural objects. Quote, "I should like to stay here long enough to let the fine inscape of the Castle Rock and of Arthur's Seat and Salisbury Peg grow on me." Hopkins exposed himself to the city, waiting for the essence of these monuments to permeate him, viewing himself as a blank surface resembling photographic film. But visual experiences are not limited to the captivation of the eye. In April 1871, he writes that, quote, "Such lovely damasking in the sky as today I have never felt before. Seeing was thus an emotion, as it entailed the processing of visual stimuli, transforming aroused feelings into manageable secondary products." Hopkins's connection to nature was not merely forced or theoretical, as he felt a bond to specific natural objects that he experienced as physical. His specific fondness for trees is well illustrated in this well-known entry of April 8, 1872. Quote, "The ash tree growing in the corner of the garden was felled. It was lopped first. I heard the sound, and looking out and seeing it maimed, there came at that moment a great pang, and I wished to die, and not to see the inscapes of the world destroyed any more." Hopkins's distress is palpable through the breathless urgency with which the entry is composed. The absence of punctuation signals revolt and protest. More consistency than in the previous decade, in the 1870s, Hopkins included his personal point of view in his descriptions of nature. This can be seen as an attempt to overcome the irreconcilable gap between the observer and the object. Hopkins yearned for inclusion into the natural realm, but, as his diary shows, he also longed to be perceived by a human other. By indicating the angle from which he observed specific natural scenes, Hopkins made it possible for an imagined other to relive his experience, as these entries show. "A lunar halo. I looked at it from the upstairs bathroom on February 23, 1872, or with William Kerr, who took me up a hill behind ours, a first-grown and heathy hill, from which I could look round the whole country, up the valley towards Ruthin and down to the sea, on September 6, 1874. The inclusion of the precise standpoint offered an opportunity for identification to a possible reader of the diary, thus making the diarist's very private experience accessible and relivable. Hopkins ceased to write a diary in 1875. While it is impossible to attempt an explanation for the end of the diary, it is conceivable that Hopkins had begun to suspect the danger of self-preoccupation, to use Seville's phrase, and to doubt the fruitfulness of self-inscaping emotional labor. Moreover, the many distractions of his life as a priest, he was ordained in 1877, did not allow for the extensive observation of nature that he had been used to over the previous years, and thus made him unable to sustain his ontology. Rather than to merely signify himself through description, he longed for signification through poetic creation and publication. He now craved the self-actualization of public authorship. His letter to Robert Bridges of February 15, 1879, expresses a clear desire to be seen and inscaped by others. Quote, "If someone in authority knew of my having some poems printable and suggested my doing it, I should not refuse. I should be partly, though not altogether, glad." Getting his poems ready for posthumous publication, Hopkins moves away from the self-inscaping private diary to the public arena of actualized authorship. While 1875 is the last year of which we possess a diaristic record, Hopkins' subsequent poems, letters, and sermons provide evidence of a gradual disillusionment with his religious aesthetic worldview. This disenchantment culminated in the 1880s, a period during which Hopkins was very unhappy with his work at University College Dublin. At this point, he realized that through the productive displacement of his desires and by trying to gain control over his feelings, he had, paradoxically, lost power over his life. Hopkins' intense fear of going blind in 1888 and the again paradoxical fact that he did not at this point consider getting glasses suggests that, quote, more than physical difficulties were bothering him, as Robert Bernard Martin has pointed out in a recent biography. In light of the quote by Lejeune that I presented earlier, it becomes clear that Hopkins no longer saw any promise in the phraseology of the productive self that he had been trying to hold on to for some years. The strategies of emotional management adopted by a younger self could no longer match the complexity of Hopkins's professional, creative, and sexual lives. A worldview in which impulse had to be regulated through theory no longer seemed to provide the expected satisfaction. Although designed to contain the social and scientific atomism that Hopkins abhorred, it may have led him to the crisis of the unique self of his final years. Thank you. Any questions?
If anybody has any questions?
Yes.
Yes. One of the points you're making, my name is Dennis Sexton, one of the points you're making there is that he was struggling for control a lot of the time. Is there any part in the diaries where he loses that control and maybe some of the real self comes through? Because very often diaries, well, that is what one expects, that the inner person, that it'll all come out in the diary. Does that happen anywhere, especially with his sexuality?
Not to my knowledge. And also in general, diaries reveal, I have come with many diarists, with the many diaries I've read, I have come across very few such moments where there's an outburst of confession or where there's a real self coming through. I think the diary is instrumental in the process of creating an ideal self in general. But so in Hopkins, maybe Michael, I don't remember any crisis in the diary, because I think when there is a crisis, he probably just didn't write. So I think what the diary is the process of constructing a desirable self through which to perceive the world. I don't think he looked, except for the confession notes, I don't think he looked to the diary type for this type of release.
Sorry, can I follow on with a supplement? This month, 100 years ago, Roger Casement, he was hanged for treason, you probably know that. And his black diaries, they were used very much to condemn him and save him from being, save him from the hangman's noose. And but Casement, his 5 black diaries, they're in the archives in Kew. But also he has a white diary, and that's in the National Library in Ireland. And that's much more extensive. Mm-hmm. And in the white diary, a lot more detail, but none of the homosexual things are mentioned there in the white diary. Mm-hmm. And is it possible to control it that way, that this inner self which comes out in the black diaries, or they say it does, and yet he wrote the white diary in great detail and nothing of that comes out. Mm-hmm. Is it possible he was trying to do the same thing, to construct an ideal self, because he was a great humanitarian, and or was he trying to do the same with his own homosexual leanings?
Mm-hmm. Well, as I read it, I think he tried to use the energy derived from these leanings in a wider project of an ideal self. Mm-hmm. So this energy, if we can speak of sublimation maybe, or of just conscious rechanneling, yeah, I think he didn't want to separate this part. He just didn't want this part to be there as such. He wanted it to be useful, productive.
Sorry, this is Hopkins you're talking
Hopkins, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
You did ask me about Hopkins, didn't you? Because I can't really speak for the
I thought you might have done that.
No, I think this person who was hanged obviously did want to give expression to these feelings in writing, but I don't think Hopkins did.
Do you think Hopkins was using all this as a base for his poetry? Was he thinking of his poetry?
Yes, I think all the time. I didn't really show this in my talk, but there were many lists of words, and he was reflecting on the sounds of words, and I think it's kind of a preparation maybe for the poetry. So the poetry is another tertiary product of, yes. Yeah.
And it's interesting similarities to Nietzsche and Freud as well.
Mm-hmm.
Not to mention all the other great poets.
Yeah.
Blake, for instance, Infinity, and so.
Yeah.
And his thing was experience, the experience of observing.
Yes. Yeah.
The physical. His experience
Yes.
of observing the physical.
Yeah.
Not noting the physical. Not analysing the physical.
Yeah,
But
he
analysing
did a
his
bit of
experience.
that,
Yeah.
and I guess there in the background you see how he wanted to reproduce a scene, but obviously not in meticulous detail. And he did try drawing as well, so he did want to take part in this culture of drawing and observation like Ruskin, but he wasn't as involved in that. So it was more that that perception was emotional for him.
I'm just wondering, you've made me think, was there any outpouring at the time of the death of that young man who he clearly loved? Dolben?
Donovan.
Yes. If there was...
He was wrong.
Was there any outpouring of any sort that might have given clues to his innermost feelings? I can't remember myself.
Yeah, me neither, so I don't think there's anything very striking. It's been a while since I read this, and I don't think there was anything else I would have picked up on it, because it would be really significant.
Well, it would have been, and
Yeah.
I don't recall picking up anything. But if anything was a crisis, that was for him.
Yeah, I think I've read critics say that this motivated his religious path to take it much further than he might have otherwise. But that's, I think, the only...
Yeah, that feels like an exacerbated desire to suppress. That's how it comes to me. I don't know if anybody has any further thoughts.
How artificial is it to divide the diaries off from the rest of the stuff? I mean, when you say Hopkins had no outpouring of emotion, there's the religious notes, the poems.
Yeah.
Wouldn't they form part of a continuous story, rather than just saying, well, the diary's finished, but confession and self-examination doesn't finish?
Yeah, in my book, the chapter isn't finished in 1875. Yes, so the sermons and the letters and all the notes, they really there's a continuation of this process. But just, I think, as such, Inscape and In Stress doesn't seem to work as a satisfying model anymore. But I do think it is artificial to divide the diaries from the rest of the non-poetic writings, because
Or even
the
the
genres,
poetic writings.
it really
Why divide the writings?
Yes, sure. Yeah, that's even also artificial. Yeah, because I think he tried to make sense of his work through different kinds of writing, which he didn't really separate that much. Perhaps also because publication was not so
so important a factor as it is for other writers.
Okay.
Yes.
Did you work on the Zebrin diaries?
Sorry?
Did you work on his last diaries in Dublin?
No.
No. There is many scribblers and we can't read legible
Yeah.
writings. And I found that's kind of showing the emotional part.
Yeah. That would be a really important aspect to consider, which unfortunately I haven't.
It's published last year.
Oh,
2
okay.
years ago. Yeah.
Oh my, I'm really behind.
Yeah, that's
Sorry.
for me. That was
Yeah.
quite impressive.
Yes. Yeah, so you see the act of writing in the
Yeah,
physical
it's
shape of the
Yeah.
diary. Yes, it is, of course, much more direct and much more meaningful than a published text. Yes. Thank you very much for that tip. That's really useful.
Your next paper.
Yes.
Thank you.
And thank you all.
That was
I just would like to say that I remember reading one of his, somewhere in his diaries, where he spoke about being on a walk one day and he passed this lovely cornfield and he said that he took so much pleasure out of it, he thought he took too much pleasure, so that on his return he averted his gaze and looked the other way.
Yeah. Yeah, so it seems that even this neutralizing scheme didn't do enough to not have him experience pleasure. So I think this is maybe the self-flagellating effect of not allowing himself to feel too much of anything. Yeah, that's a really interesting point to mention.
It comes up as well when he's talking about learning the Welsh language, that he's taking a certain pleasure in it, so he can't continue until his superior later tells him that he must learn Welsh. Then he's delighted.
Now it's okay.
He has got a sanction.
Yeah.
Yes. And in fact, the irony of the diary is that when he was in the seminary, he decided he would give up the pleasure of poetry. Poetry was a pleasure, so he resorted to something more prosaic and to examining himself. But the great irony of it is it's full of, and you gave some examples, of poetic descriptions. He could not write poetry, despite himself.
Yeah, and I think he also asks for sanction from God by arranging his scheme in a way that looking becomes an act of worship. So that it kind of takes the guilt out of the pleasure. Yeah.
Did all this suppression and control, did that destroy him in the end, or lead to some form of mental and physical breakdown? Because he seemed to be living a very artificial life in some ways.
Yes, it was very theoretical, because he had all these different worldviews he tried to unify into one, which is very difficult. But he also says at one point in the late 1880s, I think it is, that the solitary life is a difficult one, and then one that is not altogether natural. So I think it really a combination of factors led into a downfall, if you can call it that. But it is really difficult to analyze any symptoms or. Yeah, instinctively I would say yes, but that's not really anything founded.
Well, he was of a very scrupulous temperament, and he seems to have been unfortunate in not meeting somebody who understood that temperament and who was able to guide him.
Yeah. But then Newman and the correspondence, I don't know enough about the correspondences to gauge that, but he does seem to have had a lot of exchanges in letters. Was that too superficial a correspondence, or? I'm just wondering. Yeah.
So did I hear you say towards the end of your lecture that Hopkins would have liked to have been published in order to alleviate his own loneliness, or in order that his own landscape could have been communicated? Is that, you said something like that?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm just imagining the tensions that would create, though.
Yes.
Because of the strict Jesuit idea of, well, broadly speaking, self-sacrifice. And in a sense, self-annulment.
Yeah.
And we know that George Herbert wrestled with these ideas as well, because Herbert always feared that when he wrote ingeniously, and his ingenuity was the kind that we associate with the so-called quote-unquote metaphysical poets. But when he did that, he wasn't really praising God. He was in fact showing off his own ability.
Yes.
He was being an exhibitionist. And I sometimes wonder very much about Hopkins, because he had that extraordinary love of language and indeed facility with it, whether he did undergo some self-flagellation, to use that word somebody used earlier, when he was writing poetry at its best. You know, I mean, he's putting forth his power as creator. There's a long romantic tradition of the creator poet being in competition with the creator God. Now that wouldn't arise in Hopkins' case, but he may well have been conscious of that, you know. I think that's an extraordinary tension.
Yeah.
That may have inhibited or thwarted.
Yeah. Well, I think Julia Saville, she argues that Hopkins chose like really complicated meter. He made it really difficult for himself to write, so that the product is purged of the pleasure of writing a little bit. So, like with Inscape and In Stress, he came up with schemes through which to perceive and through which to express himself that made things so complicated they couldn't be pleasurable, and therefore maybe this competition could also be averted. I don't know what you think, but...
Well, I just think it's a fascinating tension, because we know that wasn't he ordered by his superiors early on to burn his poems, and you know that tension was always there.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering how psychologically he coped with it. And in a way, I suppose I'd love to build a bridge from that to the terrible sonnets.
Yeah.
But I'm not sufficiently a Hopkinian.
Yeah, me neither.
So Hopkinsian,
Yes.
sorry, I should say.
Yeah.
But Brian, would there not be another tension between seeing his poetry as a gift from God and having that in a state of tension against the Jesuitical dogma, perhaps? Would he not have believed that his gift from God should be, publicized and published? And maybe seeing the Jesuitical dogma as being subservient to that.
It's a big question of whether a Jesuit can. I mean, these are the people who said, "Give us a boy at the age of 5 and we'll have him for the rest of his life." You know, isn't that it?
7.
It's twice 7.
Seven,
Yes, the age of reason. I think it must have been a mighty. It must have been a mighty authority he struggled against. You know. We know, of course, that one person. I'm sorry, coming back to Joyce. But Joyce did successfully struggle against that, but at a very, very high cost, I would say. Against, it wasn't his case against the Jesuits, but only his teachers. But, I think he had to liberate himself completely from Catholicism in order to be a writer. But that's a slightly different case, of course.
Just at this point, the Jesuits and up to the age of 7. Have you discovered anything in Hopkins' boyhood that might have had a profound influence on him, that set him on this path of creating his own reality, and being able to stand back in such a detached way and construct the world as he wanted to see it? Or was he trying to please anybody? His father, Manly Hopkins, perhaps, or who, or what?
Well, I only know that his father was very hurt by him converting to Catholicism, and that it really disrupted his relationship with his entire family. But I don't know anything about the childhood, unfortunately.
Yeah, just on Joyce there.
Yeah.
Joyce's father now, he drank away, say, 10 houses or something like that. And gradually they fell into poverty and shame and all the rest of it. And I'd say all that had a great influence on him. And also he seemed to be very unhappy with his mother. When she died, he wouldn't go in, he wouldn't kneel down as she asked and say an ave for her, you know. So there was a lot of resentment deep down there.
Oh. Yeah, I don't remember anything like that with Hopkins. Maybe someone else in the audience knows more about this. But
Well, I know that, I don't know whether it was at school or at the college, that he had one teacher who was reportedly a very good teacher, but took against him. Do you remember the name? I think you actually mentioned his name. And he took against Hopkins and he beat him unmercifully. But he had this self-denial, this self-flagellation from a very early stage, because I'm sure a lot of you know this story. There was a time when I think he made a bet or an agreement with one of the other students that he would go for a whole week without a drink.
3 weeks, I think. Like a
No,
sailor.
no. Oh,
No, I think
I-
he wanted to be like a sailor on a boat, no?
I thought it was a week.
I thought it was 3 weeks.
Okay, we'll have to read and find
Sorry.
out. And towards the end, he was found out by his tutor, and his mouth was already black, and he was very severely reprimanded for this. I mean, it was a totally crazy thing to do. But this self-punishment as a process of inquiry, I don't see them as separate.
Yeah.
Seems to have been in him from a very early stage.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this was at Oxford already, you know,
It might have been.
drinking, yeah.
Yeah, but at a young stage.
Yeah.
It's possible that he took some pleasure when he was being beaten like that. Because very often
That's
children that
yes.
are abused, they feel very guilty because they feel maybe a part of me allowed this to happen.
Well, that I must have been very bad if this happened.
Yeah.
And you spend possibly, theoretical, the rest of your life trying to make up for it, compensate for it, be a better person, always better, and never feeling that you could have achieved it.
Any more questions? Okay, on behalf of everybody, I'd like to thank Anne-Marie for that very stimulating and very interesting paper, and it gave rise to very interesting questions and discussion. Thank you, Anne-Marie.
Thank you.